You're listening to Community Radio, CKMS, Radio Waterloo, 102.7, 946 on the Rogers Digital Network. You can find us.
Happy Monday, Waterloo Region. It's Monday, August the 5th, civic holiday, and we have a big show with Christine Mayer from Lights for Liberty and music from JP Mortier. This is Sons of Steel.
Sons of steel, like to me, like to you. Statistics are false or untrue. Follow you, follow me, to be slave to technology. You are what you know, what you read. This data is all that you need. Sons of Steel provide you content. Do you really know of their intent? Under stress, your status is one big distress. And all to the world on your laptops and phones, conversation that keeps you alone. No war, no country worth fighting for, not a question of security. There's someone here, come rescue me. none. Rap was just another sham. Video war game in my hands. Distant brother for a foreign land. Hey, 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 hey. I've known no war, no religion worth dying for. Those who preach with belief are the first ones armed to the teeth. I've known no war, no cause worth believing for. I won't contribute to my demise, opening up your brand new franchise. Hey, 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 hey. I've known no war, no ideology worth fighting for. Take those headlines from the Cold War years. Insert terrorists for communist here and here. And here. Hey, 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 hey. Think you're protecting your family and your homeland security. You're just fighting for refineries, the sweatshop of third world factories. I've known no war, no nation worth fighting for. Take your crusade elsewhere, please. Won't be spreading your disease. I've known no war. I've known no war. I've known no war. Hey, 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 hey.
That's J.P. Mortier with I've Known No War. And before that, we heard Sons of Steel. J.P. Mortier is an artist from Montreal, singer, songwriter, and artist. He's just released a double album called Nation of Iron, consisting of 24 songs, well over 2 hours long. On this album, he targets the totalitarian powers that be: governments, corporate power, religion, ideology, technology, and other tools of destruction that want to rule our society. And that's appropriate, because today we're going to be talking to Christine Mayer and hopefully Kira Williams, who were the organizers behind Lights for Liberty. It took place on Friday, July the 12th at Waterloo Town Square. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you so much for having us.
What prompted you to do this? So tell us, first of all, what's Lights for Liberty all about?
Sure. So Lights for Liberty is an international campaign to end migrant detention, which was specifically targeting the migrant detention that was happening in the U.S. and is still happening in the U.S. and was a sort of international event. More than 800 of these actually took place all at the same time, a candlelight vigil to sort of raise awareness around children being separated from their families, the appalling conditions that were happening at the border, and what it means for individuals who are seeking asylum to be incarcerated in really horrific conditions. And so this event was about trying to sort of be in solidarity with those that are fighting for their lives in the States, to be saying that we don't stand for what's happening. But also our event specifically locally was attempting to have a more intersectional analysis to really be appreciating the ways in which Canada also participates in migrant detention and how this particular issue is not new, but is related to many different systems of oppression that have existed since the founding of what we now call Canada. Yeah. How
did Canadians involved with what is I would perceive as an American problem.
Sure. Well, this was a group of three of us, friends, who came together because we didn't see anything happening locally on this issue. There are many people in Canada who talk about sort of illegal detention of individuals, but there was no sort of local Lights for Liberty campaign happening. So Healy Thompson, who is also a PhD student, and Giselle Diaz, who is a PhD student locally here, and myself kind of came together as a way of our different sort of issues and things that we care about all sort of showed up here. So I look a lot at how kids experience trauma and how in particular kids who are racialized aren't seen as trauma victims and therefore aren't treated as though they're fully human. Giselle does a lot of sort of abolition of prisons work, and Healy looks a lot at how gender shows up historically and also currently in the ways in which people experience oppression. So this was a topic that sort of brought our three areas together, and we had amazing outreach and sort of calls out from the community to join us, and had 10 incredible speakers with a range of different backgrounds who were able to join us for the event and speak to these issues on July 12th.
So we're hoping to get Giselle into the studio as well today.
I hope so, yes.
Good, because we've had a bit of an ongoing theme. We've had Matt Whitehin from Greenlight Arts just
Yes.
before Guarded Girls. I've interviewed Senator Pate on incarceration. So hopefully we can continue that for a bit.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. So the thrust of I was there on
Yes.
July the 12th. Carried a candle and learned a lot of stuff, largely about the problems with the 60s scoop, for example.
Mhm.
Can you quickly go over that as well, 60 scoop?
For sure. So to be clear, I'm a white settler. I'm not Indigenous. So this is speaking from my own perspectives of the history, which has been embedded in sort of colonial history. So I think that's important to know. But we had multiple Indigenous speakers, and Giselle is also Indigenous, who's one of the organizers of the event, who were talking about sort of the fact that families are being separated, children are being separated is not a new phenomenon. This is something that has gone on from the beginning of the colonization of Turtle Island. But in particular, there have been flashpoint times. The 60s scoop was a time where Indigenous children were being removed from their families and placed in either foster care systems or in residential schools. And that continues today. So there are actually more Indigenous children who are in CAS custody or in foster care than there were during the time of residential schools. So this is not new practice. And I think as Canadians, sometimes it can be very easy to sort of wag our fingers at the US for doing these things without sort of paying attention to the ways in which we've participated in it and continue to do so now.
It needs more attention because I didn't know this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's intentional that you didn't know this. I think that's part of how it continues to happen, is sort of hiding from plain view some of the ways in which this goes on a regular basis in Canada.
So being suppressed by the government agencies responsible for doing this?
I think so, and by the education system and by white settlers who benefit from it not being in sort of public view. Yeah, absolutely.
And then mainstream media is either not aware of it or is choosing not to report on it.
Yeah, that's right. I think so. Yeah.
But you said intersectional. There was a lot more.
Oh, sure. I'll probably forget some of them, but I can talk about a couple of the other pieces, and then maybe we can do a deeper dive into some of the different issues as we go. But so we looked at sort of how this relates to colonization more generally. So specifically in terms of Indigenous people, but also how these borders to begin with were sort of created illegally and now are being enforced by people who came and colonized and stole land. So I think that's a really important piece to consider, that many of the people who are being locked up right now at these border detention camps, both in Canada and in the US, are people that are Indigenous to this land and being locked up by people who are not Indigenous to this land. So that's one part. There's certainly a lot of profit being made. So like all of our carceral systems, there are huge amounts of profit being made in the US in particular by the privatization detention camps, by ICE facilities, and by prisons themselves, but also in the Canadian context as well. So, capitalism certainly shows up in the mix. We had one speaker, Samantha Estoesta, who talked about financial migration detention and the ways in which migrant workers in Canada, so she was speaking specifically about Filipina and Filipino workers, but mostly Filipino workers who are brought here typically for sort of domestic tasks, who end up being economically enslaved.
Simply because they don't have the finances to
correct.
leave.
Yeah, they don't have the finances to leave, and disproportionately face domestic violence in the home and sexual assault in the home. Certainly, we know there's been many incidents of people having their passports being removed from them, those kinds of things. So there's lots of pieces that kind of end up in the mix. And we also had speakers who talked about sort of the intersection with LGBTQ rights and issues. So in particular, trans women, there have been at least 2 reported deaths of trans women in the detention camps in the US, but some of the reasons in which forced migration happens can do with queer issues, and the treatment of trans people and queer people at the border tends to be more violent and harmful, and again, not seen as sort of legitimate trauma victims. So that also ends up in the mix as well, in addition to sort of, anti-immigrant hate, to the anti-Muslim hate, to sort of how all these different pieces kind of come together.
Right.
Yeah.
In Canada, we've got detainees as well.
Yes.
Are they being kept in private refugee camps, for-profit refugee camps?
It's a good question. So I want to be clear that my area of research is not as an expert in migrant detention. So please take everything I say with a grain of salt. So this is pulled mostly from the information that I've been able to do some research on, but there are many who've done this work for much longer. But in Canada, the camps that you're seeing in the US aren't quite what you're seeing in Canada. So in the US, there's privately owned corporations who are running these camps, who are making millions of dollars off of these camps. That doesn't operate in quite the same way in Canada. So in Canada, we also have family detention. Families are given, quote unquote, a choice about whether or not their children stay with them in detention or not. The choice usually means, unless there's family members already in Canada that they can contact, who they often can't because they're not given internet access when they're in these sort of detention facilities in Canada. What that usually means is they have a choice of either their children being removed from them and put in CAS or foster care in Canada with no assurances that they will necessarily get their children back, or that their children will stay with them, which means their children are being incarcerated alongside them. So that's kind of how it operates in Canada. And there are both sort of separate detention facilities, and also provincial jails are sometimes where these families and children are placed. There's very little information, public information, about how many individuals are housed and where at any one time, largely because there's no watchdog agency who's reporting any of that information about what's happening in the Canadian context. So we actually have less data than we do in the US around how many people are being held at any one time.
So where would the watchdog come from? Would that be a civilian oversight board?
Yeah, I think that's one possibility. There isn't currently one of any kind, so I think anything would be better than nothing. But yeah, there needs to be some oversight in terms of what's happening, and oversight, frankly, with some teeth. So it's one thing if you have a watchdog agency, but if they don't have any ability to change policy or to put pressure on legislation or to ensure that there is a way that things change, a watchdog agency won't do much good, I don't think.
Think of the privacy commissioner as an example of how not to do things.
Right. Well, yes. Yeah.
So we're speaking now of refugees that have actually crossed the border,
Sure.
Possibly an indigenous population there as well, but also from outside of North America, outside of Turtle Island coming in.
Sure. Yeah.
Canada announces that it is one of the most welcoming nations for refugees. How does that correlate with what you've just told us?
I think it depends on who you are as a refugee. I think that really matters. So There are particular times and particular groups that are welcomed, I think, sometimes in the Canadian context. Groups that are racialized tend to face far higher difficulties in terms of employment, housing, discrimination, and racism in Canada. And, I think that there's a real difference, too, in terms of thinking about people who arrive to Canada directly versus those who are trying to cross to Canada but are unable to do so because of, I believe it's called the Safe Third Country legislation. I was just looking at the name to make sure I didn't get it wrong, where there's an agreement sort of made between the US and Canada that if refugees cross into the US first, that they are then not able to cross into Canada because they have arrived in a safe country. And so what that means is refugees who are facing these kinds of appalling conditions in the US where, there's no ability to shower, the overcrowding, no beds, lack of toothpaste, sanitary conditions, disease sort of running rampant, terrible things that are happening. If they try to cross into Canada to try to have better conditions, they will be turned away at the border and told that their asylum is not welcome. So I think Canada does a better job than the US, but I don't think, it's similar to what I was saying before. I don't think Canada should pat itself on the back by sort of claiming that we do well for all people, because we don't.
Yeah. There have been calls to rescind the Safe Third Country Agreement in Canada.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it absolutely should be rescinded. This is not a new problem. Certainly Trump's administration has made it worse in the US. The conditions have spiraled to terrible conditions, and the numbers have greatly increased, both because there are more people needing to seek asylum because of what's happening in Central America, but also I think the numbers have increased because of the ways in which the government has sort of put totalitarian pressure at the border.
Just listening or reading the comments made by President Trump do not make the U.S. sound like a welcoming area for refugees.
Certainly not. When you're comparing people to, not people, but to vermin, there's a problem, right? And I think that's done intentionally. It's part of the dehumanization in order for average Americans, particularly white middle-class Americans, to not have to consider what's happening. It reduces the cognitive dissonance. If we were not thinking about people as people, it's easier for us to allow horrific things to happen and to sit by. Yeah.
But in both countries, opposition governments, the Democrats in the U.S. and the conservatives here, or the liberals here, or the Republicans in the U.S., all seem to treat this in a very similar manner. There's no difference in policy from what I can gather.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's important too. So detention existed under Obama. It exists now under Trudeau. I mean, it's not something that necessarily shifts depending on which political party is in power. I do think the conditions for sure have gotten worse at the border under Trump, but the policy itself around detaining people who are seeking asylum, who are seeking refuge because of violence, either in their own countries or severe economic deprivation, largely due to colonial practices, which is also important to note, are treated in this way. And so, again, it's not just a unique current issue. The sort of concentration camp level of horror, I think, is new, but the policy itself of putting people in prison, period, but putting people in prison specifically who are seeking refugee status is not new.
So what changes would you like to see? Rescinding the Safe Third Country Act, for starters.
I think that's a really important one. I also think that prisons in general should not exist in the way that they do. I don't think it does any good to lock folks up in this kind of way.
They've committed no criminal act.
Yeah, and even people who have, I don't think prisons are either effective nor humane.
Certainly isn't rehabilitative.
No, it's not rehabilitative, and I think it ignores many of the conditions that put people at risk of being incarcerated to begin with. It ignores the trauma that many people face, the racism that many people face, the poverty that many people face, who are often sort of breaking the law for survival. and who then are treated in a way in which makes them not seem as though they're human. And we allow that to happen because it's in a closed, barred off space. Yeah. So I think it links to prison sort of culture to begin with. Yeah.
I don't think most Canadians realize that Canada has a culture of prisons.
No, I think most Canadians, again, will see the problem in the US. They may have watched some documentaries. Netflix has had a few that have come out recently that are sort of focused on mass incarceration in the US. And again, we ignore the way in which that operates in the Canadian context. We don't have the same kind of privatization of prisons, but there are many companies who profit off of the prisons in Canada. And we certainly grossly disproportionately incarcerate people of color in this country. Yeah.
So aside from becoming more welcoming, drawing some attention to the issue as it exists is probably worthwhile. So hopefully we're doing some of that today by,
I hope so.
by making this a little bit more well known.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk to you some more about Lights for Liberty, the actual organization of the whole event and how that went. Let's have a little bit more music first. Back to JP Mortier. This is Resurrection from his Nation of Iron album. We'll return with Christine Mayer and Kira Williams, who's just arrived at the studio. Welcome, Kira. And we'll be back after listening to Resurrection.
The trolls are out in the open, and it's hunting season. The hounds and the pounds, and the hermit in his kingdom. The rich man in his mansion, fingers on his triggers. This is my comeback, a figment of my resurrection.
That's JP Mortier from his Nation of Iron album, Resurrection. We're joined in the studio now also by Kira Williams, a postdoc. Tell us, Kira, where are you a postdoc at?
I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo.
In the international, the research.
The Balsillies. So technically I'm affiliated with the International Migration Research Center, which is a research at Wilfrid Laurier University. You can see that, the universities kind of have interaction with each other, but I'm housed at the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Uptown Waterloo.
That's right. Okay. We see lots of events happening there of an international nature, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
You've got some expertise in this area of migration.
Just a little, yeah.
We were talking about some of the changes that we wanted to see happen in our current laws and our current ways of handling refugees. Most people don't realize that refugees coming across the border are being incarcerated or being held in prisons. What's your perspective on that?
Well, as somebody who's actually done quite a bit of research on respect to, how should I say it, those who cross the border without documentation or those who cross in violation of state laws, I understand that essentially migrant detention is a widespread practice, and it has many dehumanizing consequences for those who actually go through it. My recommendations, honestly, would be, at the very least, for Canada to remove its third safe country agreements with other countries which deny actual recognition of refugee claims, essentially for those who travel from countries in, say, Central America or even the United States. And also basically to delimit, if not remove entirely, the practice of detention, especially those that basically detain families and children.
Yeah, and that's detention, not just for migrants and refugees, but detention in general?
In general, yes. It's a practice that's actually quite widespread. So for example, let's say you're a temporary migrant who loses their status. Before you end up being deported potentially by, say, CBSA, you could end up in a migrant detention center.
CBSA is what?
The Canadian Border Security Agency.
Okay, border guards.
Yep.
Yeah. And so they have their own detention facilities?
Basically, I mean, some of it is administered through private contracts. Sometimes they do make use of local jails, but it's a relatively rare practice. Usually what happens in Canada is that there are dedicated facilities essentially for migrant detention. Sometimes they're the places you least suspect. So for example, major international airports have holding facilities for migrants, for example.
Jails at the airports?
Basically.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't think most people know that.
Nope, and it's not something you think about when you go through an airport, right?
No, you wouldn't expect it to be held there. I mean, being held in the waiting room because your flight's delayed is one thing,
but being essentially imprisoned because you're not recognized on some level as a human being is an extra step.
So at a detention facility at the border, at an airport, what's a typical length of stay there for somebody who gets detained?
Well, it depends on the country in question and it depends on the laws, but I have to say that often the laws aren't followed, unfortunately. So technically in some jurisdictions, it can be an indefinite stay. So for example, you're simply detained until some procedure legally releases you. In other places, there are delimitations for how long you can stay in detention. So for example, in Canada, there are restrictions on how long you can technically be in migrant detention. However, the enforcement of those provisions is highly dependent upon the actual, enforcement by, say, CBSA or other authorities.
And they have a lot of discretion in how they apply the law.
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, that's one of the kind of really strong characteristics about being a migrant in this situation or a refugee is that essentially you're under a lot of arbitrary discretion by bureaucrats that you don't really know very well, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And it can change, I suppose, from one installation to another. So the way that it's handled at, say, Toronto International Airport might be vastly different from the way it's handled at Montreal Airport.
It's possible, yeah, definitely. It depends a lot, again, on basically how the different bureaucrats in the different places enforce the regulations and laws that are handed down by the federal government.
These indefinite stays, would they be entirely at the airport detention center, or would people be moved to other, hopefully more amenable locations?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, usually they try and transfer them actually from airports, but in some cases, especially in other countries as well, it's not unknown or unheard of to basically be indefinitely detained at an airport until basically either you receive a sufficient legal assistance or you're deported.
Okay. What are the facilities like there?
That's a good question. I haven't seen the facilities myself, say at Pearson Airport or in Vancouver, for example, or Montreal, but I can attest to some of the ones that I am familiar with. So for example, there are parallel facilities at, say, Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, France. And essentially what happens is that they're in a segregated part of the airport. In Vancouver, if I recall correctly, it's in the basement of the airport, though you'll have to double check me on that. Yeah. I have to say that in those cases, for example, usually these holding facilities or detainment, I honestly think of them as a form of imprisonment, basically are obscured from public sight. So you don't really get a chance to see unless you have some kind of special access. So for the researchers who want to access these spaces, usually what happens is you have to work with either a legal aid authority or you have to be working with a humanitarian organization.
And then it's still at the discretion of the staff there, whether or not you get access to the facilities for inspection.
Totally.
Yeah. And you said, sorry, just lost my train of thought there. You've delved in very deeply there. Once people are in there, do they have access to legal assistance? Can they bring their lawyers into the facility to negotiate for them?
Well, in most countries that actually enact detention systems, there is a technical legal access to legal assistance. However, the actual ability to access legal authority, again, heavily depends on not only knowledge of, say, the languages which are available to you, the availability of translators, the availability of legal aid organizations to actually assist you on site. I mean, a lot of it depends on basically help from the outside. And depending on where you are, getting help from the outside might be a difficult time.
I expect that somebody who's fleeing has not prepared well for, being detained by the people they're fleeing to.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, migrants don't intend to become detained. That's not their plan, right? And how should I say it? Many of these journeys are incredible. They're multi-staged. They take a lot of time. They often are journeys that you and I, who are born in Canada, necessarily will be very lucky to never have to take. But for those who do have to make these incredible journeys, how should I say it? There is a lot of uncertainty about what will happen to you as you progress through your journey. And honestly, most people don't plan to have these kind of things happen to them. But once they happen, you have to be able to learn to navigate your new situation.
Yeah. Do you have any idea of the numbers involved here?
It's a good question. I actually was reviewing them a few weeks ago in the Canadian context, but unfortunately, my strongest expertise actually is in the European Union. So I can give you some quotations for that. In the United States, it's approximately 30,000 to 35,000 people are detained at any given time. In the European Union, it's also somewhere in the range of tens of thousands as well. In Canada, it's a bit less because obviously we have fewer people here relatively, and there are fewer people, say, trying to cross the border compared to somewhere like the United States. But we're still talking thousands of people.
And in how many facilities?
That's a good question. So do you mind if I make a comparison with the United States?
Yeah, go ahead. No,
yeah, so the United States has a variation of facilities somewhere between 1,000 to 2,000, I believe. In the United States, they're dispersed widely, essentially, and some local facilities also become holding places for detention. But in Canada, I think the figure is a lot less. Typically, they're concentrated into dedicated facilities, or they're spread rarely into local facilities as well. So, for example, in the Toronto area, there are some local prisons that are actually used as detention centers. But I have to follow up after the show to give you the exact numbers.
Okay, yeah, we'll put that in the show notes if you can bring that back to me. And so just quick back of the envelope calculation there. If there's a few hundred facilities and tens of thousands of refugees, that's a few hundred people at each of those facilities.
It is. And in the United States, since that's often what's on the people's political radar right now, that can lead to very overcrowded conditions.
Yeah. I've seen pictures of conditions in the States, literal cages.
Yes, that's effectively what they are.
I would have thought that there would at least be, bedding facilities and segregated sleeping areas and the like, but we have no idea because we've not been given access to the facilities themselves.
Well, you also have to appreciate, and I don't want to defend the border authorities in the United States, but essentially they're on a prescribed budget. So essentially when they contract out their work, usually how they do it is by bed, quite literally. So in terms of the contractors who actually receive or allocate funds for bedding, often what will happen is they receive more people than are allocated in the contract. And essentially at that point, they literally have no more beds to allocate to anyone.
I see. Is it true that because this is a for-profit industry based on a head count, really, that border security officials are more aggressive in detaining people simply for the profit motive?
That's a good question, honestly. And I think different people would have different takes on it. I think my take is that migrant detention is an industry on some level, and that essentially the for-profit motive invariably drives people's behavior when it's an incentive to actually do things. Now, if you look at the legislation, would you find that? And the answer would be no, I think. But the thing is that we all know, I think, in theory is sometimes different than how things play out in the real world.
Yeah, very true. So what legal basis is there for us to attack? What laws needs to be changed?
Well, I think first we should take a step back and think about what laws should be recognized, actually. And first, we need to recognize the international treaties and conventions that Canada has signed with respect to our obligations defining what we do with migrants and refugees. So if we look at something like the Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees, for example, it says that basically there is a right to claim asylum in different countries. And it defines that one can actually leave their country of origin in order to actually make these claims. That would probably be a good starting point. And Canada is a signatory, as well as the United States. Okay. But in terms of our own legislation at home, I think, again, what we need to do is basically, on some level, start to reimagine and reset the agenda on what exactly our priorities are. So for example, one thing that I gave that was very concrete was basically dismantling these third safe country agreements, which, if you're not familiar, they allow essentially Canada to claim that some countries are safe for purposes of asylum. And therefore, anybody who comes from that country and tries to claim refugee or migrant status, their application is basically not processed in the same way. So
just denied outright because they're not at risk.
They're considered not at risk. And in fact, that can often be from places where people are in fact at risk. So for example, Canada has a safe third country agreement with Israel, but we know that many people who actually technically live in Israel live in occupied territory, for example, in Palestine. Right. So if you come from Palestine, your application might actually be thrown out in part because you're recognized as Israeli.
Really?
Yes.
Even though that's disputed territory? Oh my goodness. Okay, there's a whole kettle of fish that you probably need to get into in great detail at another show. Holy mackerel. All right. You were at the July 12th thing. You spoke very eloquently. I learned a lot from you.
Oh.
So, which is why you're here today, because I'd like you to just spread that out to a larger listening public. So thank you very much for being here today.
I'm just so grateful.
Yeah. Christine, you're still here too.
I sure am.
Yeah. You're going to talk about the organization of the event. How did you meet up with Kira?
So Kira came to us actually the day of the event or the day before. Kira was willing to join us. And when we heard their expertise, we not only couldn't say no, but we're so grateful that Kira was able to sort of speak at the event and be able to represent as a board member and really be able to bring some of their expertise on migrant detention specifically to the event itself. We put a call out, the three of us sort of came together, Giselle, Healy, and myself, and started to sort of work the networks that we have. None of the three of us are from here. All of us have been living in Kitchener-Waterloo for less than 5 years.
Oh my.
Very thin networks locally. And really we're trying to see like who cares about these issues in the area, who is knowledgeable about these issues in the area, and not see ourselves as the center. We really were trying to write ourselves out of the event, but do what we know how to do well, which is organize and hold space and bring incredible people together, and try not to take up too much room, frankly. Yeah. So we put a call out to the networks that we had. We cold called and emailed many people locally. We reached out to some of the local Canadian organizations who do this kind of work. No One is Illegal Toronto, to Migrante. We sort of tried to put together a list of people who we thought might make sense. And then a lot of it was past word of mouth. We had individuals who said, who would be great, this person or this person. And we ended up with such an incredible lineup of 10 folks spanning all kinds of different intersectional backgrounds and research and professional expertise to really kind of pull this event together. So that's what the organization looked like. And it actually happened incredibly quickly. It was about 3 weeks before the event itself actually occurred. Healy, who sort of got the ball rolling, and I actually have a statement from her I'm going to read in just a second, but she sort of contacted us and said, we've got to do something. Nothing's happening locally. The closest one is in Toronto, and what can we kind of do on this front? And we just kind of made it happen as quickly as possible, but as thoughtfully and as intersectionally as possible in the time that we had, and had great turnout. We had over 100 people show up. Yeah. Dozens of kids were also there. It was well attended, especially for a summer, Friday night in the summer. We were excited about those who were able to join and those who got to hear about it because they were in one of the restaurants or in the sort of Waterloo town.
I saw a number of passersby stop in and pay attention.
And a lot of people asking questions or taking some information. We had handouts and things there so that people could take away some action steps and things they could do, but also some information about what is happening both in the US and also in the Canadian context as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have trouble booking the space?
We didn't. We actually, what I didn't know before is that Waterloo Town Square is actually zoned as a public park. And so the way that it works is that if there isn't another event already being held there, you're actually able to hold an event as long as you're not sort of making money off of the event. But if
Right.
it's a public event, so for us, something like a vigil, there's a individual you can contact who's in charge of it at the city. We were in good touch with him, and he was able to help arrange the space for us and let us know that there was no other event happening at the time. Somebody had tried to book it. We could have had the first right of refusal and paid for the space, but we were able to use it actually very easily. And I think that's important for people locally to know.
That's really good to know. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things it used to be a parking lot. It used to be the parking lot for the mall right behind it.
Okay.
And when it was redeveloped into what looks largely like a concrete area with a rusty sculpture off to the side, people were saying, this is absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
But it's been such a vibrant area for
Absolutely.
Waterloo.
So many beautiful events happen there.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very, very good. You're going to be joined by Giselle, hopefully.
I hope so. Yeah.
Okay. So let's return to a little bit of music, and we'll regroup in a little while.
Great.
Equality and security is not what it ought to be. If 2 out of 3 vote for the fool, is this democracy? Why can't we be the land of the free? If my brother can't be free, my sister can't be free, my children can't be free, then I am not free. Just one man isn't free, one woman isn't free. If one child isn't free, then we are not free. 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 I wanna be an American, drive a big black car, take my blue-eyed girlfriend for a burger and a Coke, catch you driving under the stars. We could have fun at the firing range, a midnight boardwalk stroll, go for a ride on the interstate, cruising while listening to some rock and roll. I wanna be an American. We could go to church every Sunday and watch a football game. With God on our side, we'd make fun of the handicapped and the lame. I wanna be an American, invade some foreign country. Everyone would smile and wave, 'cause they'd all wanna be me. I wanna be an American. Don't you want to be an American too? Don't you want to spend your day at the zoo? Don't you want to be an American too? I want to be an American like you, like you. We could all be Americans. We could be all the same, flying our little flags in the air, all lit up with the same flame. We wanna be Americans.
We want to be Americans. We want to shop at Walmart. We want to go to the Target range. Prophetic for the events that happened this weekend. As you may have heard on other news stations, there's been a couple of mass shootings in the US again, and probably leading to trauma. Christine, you've told me that you're actually a trauma counselor.
That's right. So my background is as a trauma therapist with a T and as a drama therapist with a D. So my career as a therapist has been working primarily with folks who have experienced a wide variety of different kinds of trauma, both single event, one-time bad things, and lifetimes of really horrific things. And I ran a trauma clinic. I was a clinical director, assistant clinical director of the Post-Traumatic Stress Center in New Haven, Connecticut for several years, where in part, some of the folks that we were treating were survivors of mass shootings. So the Newtown Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting happened about 30 minutes from where our clinic was. And so we were treating and working with many of the children and teachers and family members, survivors from that event. But also working with those who were, that was a mostly white middle class town and set of victims, but locally in New Haven, many Black and brown people were being shot regularly due to violence that was happening in the neighborhood, and were not getting the same kind of care or attention or public resources put towards the kinds of trauma that they had experienced. And so we were very interested as a clinic, and this is what my research is about, is who counts as a trauma victim, which kinds of children do we worry about, and how that sometimes has a lot to do with both class and race, in terms of which children we see as innocent and needing protection. And I think that's part of what drove me very much to the Lights for Liberty event, is that I saw a group of individuals and children being treated less than human, and that their trauma of being separated from their families, of facing appalling neglect, of potentially never seeing their family members again, or if they do so with severe disruptions to that kind of attachment, that trauma didn't seem to matter in the same way that it might if white and middle class children were being removed from their families. Very similar to the way in which, as we were talking at the top of the show, Indigenous families are not seen as fully human, and that the trauma of being separated from your family and community might not be seen as the same level of disaster as it might for other populations of white sort of settler Canadians.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you've come here to Canada.
I've come to Canada.
To do what?
I've come to Canada I'm doing my PhD at Laurier in social work. And I specifically look at the education system. So the ways in which particular children are seen as students who might need support. So who are getting flagged based on the trauma symptoms they're expressing, as somebody who might need to receive more counseling, that we need to be taking care of, and that those are often white students. And that students of color, in my case, I particularly look at the ways in which Black students, for showing the same sort of signs of trauma, rather than receiving support, instead end up being disproportionately punished in the schools. And it's part of the pathway towards sort of criminalization and the sort of school to prison pipeline that is often talked about in the US and typically ignored in the Canadian context. So my research is specifically at how that kind of shows up in the Canadian context.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's in your future when you've attained your degree? What happens then?
I hope for a job.
Here or
yes, I'd like to stay in Canada.
Oh, good. That's kind of what I was hoping for.
Despite the song of "We Want to Be Americans,"
Yeah.
I actually grew up in Bermuda. Bermuda's home for me. My mother is Canadian. My father is from the Caribbean. He has one parent from Bermuda and one from Barbados, and so I've spent a good deal of my adult life moving backwards and forwards between the US and Canada. I think the problems are much more similar than we like to think in the Canadian context, but I prefer this side of similar if I must be in one of the two locations. And I also think that as a white half Canadian, there's a way for me to be able to sometimes draw attention to the way that race shows up in Canada that isn't being discussed in the same kind of way. And to say, we should be appalled at what's happening in the US, and we should be appalled at what's happening in Canada too. Yeah.
You said drama therapy with a D. What is that?
Yeah, great question. So drama therapy with a D is part of a bigger umbrella of creative arts therapies. So creative arts therapies use the arts as part of the healing mechanisms and modalities. So people are creative arts therapists. In my case, I'm a drama therapist.
So I can see music therapy.
Yeah.
Or hear music therapy.
That's right. Music and art. Yeah, music and art are the two that are more well known. Dance movement therapy and drama therapy were smaller in numbers, but strong in practice. So drama is the intentional use of things like story, metaphor, role, characters, improvisation, and play as part of the natural healing process. So if you think about children, for example, especially young children, they don't process verbally what's going on. They actually process through play. So for example, if you take a child to the dentist and they have their teeth drilled and they're kind of freaked out by that, if you watch them when they play, when they come home, you'll see with their dolls and with their toys that they replay this sort of piece as a way of kind of understanding and processing going to the dentist, right?
Yes.
So that's not a traumatic event for most people to go to the dentist.
I've seen that in my own son.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Or
not the dentist. It was a hailstorm, actually. You were caught in a hailstorm. And when he got home, he was still pre-verbal. In the evening before going to bed, he was, beating himself on the head with his fist.
Exactly.
Reenacting the hailstorm.
Exactly. So this is part of how kids naturally process new information is through play. When kids have experienced trauma, the play can become incredibly disrupted. And so that's part of what we use is play as part of the healing mechanism so that they can process those difficult things as well.
Really cool. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Got to take a station break and back at 11 o'clock.
Hey, what's up, Waterloo? This is DJ Denham, and you're tuned in to CKMS 1027 Radio Waterloo, broadcasting out of Waterloo, Ontario for 40 years and counting.
Who decides where I live? Who decides how I die? Turning laws, broken rules, set my gang of fools. Anarchy doesn't work. Leave the fuckers in the dirt. Baby, don't look at me. I'm not the one. Who decides? Yeah, who decides? Enemy, DNA, chromosomes, all those plans in your hormones, all the squirts of the soul, none you can't control. Is my heart, is my head, is my sex or is my time? Baby, don't look at me, sure in my mind. Who decides? Yeah, who decides? Enemy, who decides? Yeah, who decides? Enemy. Who decides who goes to war? Who decides to take a life? Must you carry a gun to protect your children and your wife? Is it government? Is it fate? Is it God, your bloody fate? Baby, don't look at me, I'm not the one. Yeah, who decides? It ain't me. Who decides? Yeah, who decides? It ain't me, it ain't me. Who decides? Yeah, who decides? It ain't me. It ain't me.
JP Mortier from his Nation of Iron album, that was Who Decides. You're listening to CKMS Community Connections on CKMS FM 102.7 Radio Waterloo. We have in the studio today Christine Mayer, who is the organizer for Lights for Liberty, and Kira Williams, who's a postdoc researcher at the, tell me again.
University of Waterloo.
Oh, University of Waterloo, okay. Tell me the research institute's name again.
Oh, the International Migration Research Center.
International Migration Research Center. I seem to have trouble with names. It's we're supposed to be joined by Healy Thompson today as well, but Healy has a bad cough, which is not amenable to radio.
No.
And so, but she's provided something to Christine, and you said you'd like to read that.
Yeah, I'd love to read it. It might give a little bit of the backstory about what was driving Healy into wanting to co-organize this event.
Yeah,
so
please do.
This is from Healy. When I heard that Lights for Liberty vigils were being organized across the United States and around the world, I wanted to help make something happen in Kitchener-Waterloo for two reasons. First, I believed it was essential that as many vigils happen as possible in as many places as possible in order to raise our voices to end migrant detention. Second, I believe that public demonstrations hold great potential to mobilize and empower people. I know how easy it is to feel overwhelmed and helpless in the face of something so horrible. For months, my social media news feed has been filled with stories of the inhumane conditions in the US migrant detention camps. Every day, I would scroll past headline after headline with my stomach in knots. The pictures and headlines flooded my brain with images of my own children, separated from me, terrified, hungry, and sick. I couldn't read an article without feeling sick to my stomach and imagining what it would be like to be separated from my own kids in conditions like that. I was numbed by the horror and overwhelmed by my sense of insignificance in comparison to the size of the problem. So I stopped reading articles. I just couldn't do it. But something changed for me about 3 weeks before Lights for Liberty. A headline got through to me and it clicked that while my inaction on this issue might be due to caring too much, not too little, it was still inaction. Far too many people stood by during the Holocaust, during residential schools, during the Japanese internment. I may not have had a chance to act on those issues, but I will not be a bystander to these crimes against humanity. So I decided to just start taking action, to believe that doing something, no matter how small, was better than doing nothing. I started by making a donation to RACES, an organization working in the US to end migrant detention. Then I wrote an email to my MP. I started sharing articles on Facebook and encouraging my friends to take an action a day. And then I heard about Lights for Liberty, and I decided that I would help make an event in Kitchener-Waterloo happen as a way to take action myself. And I also hoped it would provide a way for others to start taking action too. We had over 100 people join us in Waterloo Public Square that night. It was a powerful intersectional event, and I look forward to continuing this movement building with folks throughout the region. So that's from Healy and a little bit about her journey towards organizing the event.
Thank you, Healy.
Yeah, thank you, Healy.
It went off really, really well. So you said that you yourself were involved, maybe 3 weeks before?
That's right.
Contacting as many people as you could.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got an email from you through the WR Nonviolence group.
That's right.
Who would be amenable to the whole idea of reducing the amount of violence in the world. Weren't able to do anything for you, I'm afraid, but it is nice to be invited. Thank you for that.
We're glad to have you with us, and you did publicize the event on this show, and now you're having us here. So I think, maybe not in your official capacity, but you, Bob, did lots for us. So I'm very glad we reached out to you. Yeah.
Migrant issues aren't just in the United States. They're not just in Canada. They're worldwide. Kira, your expertise is in European migrants.
Yes. So my PhD research was primarily on migrants who travel by boat in the Mediterranean Sea, actually, Bob.
Yeah. That's always in the news. That seems to get a lot more attention than migrant issues here in Canada.
Absolutely, because of the spectacular nature of the journeys. But in Canada, too, I should say, there are parallels. We've had our own boat arrivals, too, in the past, like in 1999 with the Vigil boat, for example.
And I remember earlier in the 70s, there were boats arriving from Vietnam. That's right. Have the laws changed since the 1970s?
Oh, absolutely. Probably the most major changes are on the international level with respect to, maybe we should talk about two parallel processes. The first is the international changes. So there have been new conventions that basically ascribe what the right to different territories are at sea, and also enshrine a need to save people at sea, no matter where they are. So essentially, we have this international system now of search and rescue that legally requires countries to have to rescue migrants who travel by boat. The second thing, though, is that borders have been getting tighter over time. So countries have been cracking down, I guess you could say, on the movement of migrants who journey by boat to these countries.
So it sounds like those two laws are in conflict with each other. That, one is trying to keep people out, the other one requires countries to accept people coming into the shores.
Absolutely. And I think states are often dealing with these kind of contradictory motives. So in the Canadian case, for example, what we see, and in the European Union context, is that essentially most of these countries, including Canada, don't want migrants to arrive by boat. And they enact laws and legislation to try and prevent that from happening. But at the same time, they're also, in their opinion, burdened by these international obligations that basically require them to have to rescue people at sea. So there's kind of a conflict. On the one hand, they recognize their need to internationally rescue people who are in distress at sea or migrants who travel by boat. But on the other hand, they don't basically want to take responsibility for the people they rescue.
Yeah. It seems that fleeing a country, being a refugee by boat, is an order of magnitude more dangerous than fleeing over land.
Well, both of them can be quite dangerous, I have to say. Often what you see is that these journeys are kind of multi-stage, like I was saying earlier. So, for example, in Libya, where we just had a horrific incident, for example, where a migrant detention center actually there was hit by an airstrike, if you recall. But many of the people who are currently in Libya often have to take long and arduous journeys over the Sahara Desert, and they make multiple stops in different cities to actually get there. And some people don't survive that journey over the Sahara. So, the journey over land can be perilous, but also the journey by boat itself, as you were pointing out, is also quite perilous.
I've heard that in the United States, migrants from South America into the United States often receive gifts of water depots that people have stashed along the way, which I understand has been made illegal. It's illegal to provide water.
Yep, it is. And many local organizations, especially in places like Arizona, have been specifically trying to keep the flow of these resources open to those who are making these journeys. But just like in the Sahara, though, for obviously different conditions, many who make the journey from Central America or South America into the southern United States also suffer from heat exhaustion or, basically the difficulties of the extreme climatic conditions.
Yeah. What sort of medical facilities exist at the detention centers when refugees arrive?
Well, it's varied. So it depends on how you arrive in the first instance. So in my research, where essentially you arrive by boat, usually what happens is those who are in extreme medical need or in distress are taken to hospital immediately, but only in cases where you're actually recognized as having a medical condition by the border guards effectively. So as we know, there are often cases where people who are in migrant detention actually suffer from extreme medical issues, but they're not recognized. And the medical coverage inside of detention centers can often be weak. So we've actually literally seen people die in detention centers due to their medical conditions.
So things that aren't recognized, things, of a chronic nature, diabetes,
chronic
perhaps,
nature, or in Australia, for instance, there was an Aboriginal woman who died in detention essentially 2012, I believe, for example, because essentially I think that she had a chronic condition related to actually fracturing of ribs. And if I recall correctly, the border guards didn't believe her when she was reporting on her conditions, essentially, and she later died in hospital. So those kind of things are also not uncommon in the United States or in the European Union.
So we're asking border guards, police officers, to be medical professionals as well.
In some sense, yeah. And again, not to defend border guards, but on the other hand, that's quite a complicated position to be in, to have to be a medical expert at the same time as being somebody who's basically your job is to keep people in a prison.
Yeah. Do you know if there's any training provided to the staff at those border facilities?
That's a good question. I'm not sure in the Canadian context, but in the European Union's context, there are definitely training regimens and modules that require you to learn the basics of some of the medical laws and treatment regimens that actually exist. But in no way would it be a comprehensive sort of medical training.
I don't recall the numbers you quoted for the European detention centers, but being large enough, there's probably a need for dedicated medical personnel.
Absolutely.
And is that provided?
Not in most European detention centers, no.
No, probably not in Canadian or US ones either.
Not that I know of, no.
No. So people depend on having their conditions recognized by
basically
gifted amateurs, perhaps, possibly trained amateurs.
Yep.
And then still at the discretion of those people to be sent to a medical facility.
And it's all about credibility too, right? Yeah. So on the one hand, it's about the recognition of whether your condition is, first of all, seen as a valid medical condition. So for many who make the journey, for instance, they may say have used drugs before, or maybe they had a past addiction, and they don't receive proper medical coverage in order to actually receive treatment. Or if you're trans, for example, like me, you might not receive adequate support for your hormone replacement therapy by virtue of your position, because you might not be seen as medically valid by the border agency.
Right. So just discrimination there based on moral judgments.
Basically, and on some level, just like we were hearing earlier, that comes down to issues like race, class, country of origin, things like that. These are all social forces that play into those things when we make a decision about who has a right to help and who does not.
It seems like a gimme that, these are people, they deserve, their human rights. I mean, that's...
You think so?
I think so.
And that's definitely what I think too. Yeah.
But I think that's why it's so important to pay attention to the rhetoric that is intentionally not humanizing language, right? So like the sort of pulling up of animalistic language, vermin type language, disease type language when talking about migrants, I think is
Mhm.
part of the ways in which we don't have to worry about humans being harmed if we're seeing them as not human. And the rise of that rhetoric, I think, makes it easier to do these horrific things to people.
And that very much is a settler colonialist mindset where,
For sure.
you know, thinking of the doctrine of discovery, people who weren't of the Christian faith and white were not considered to be people.
Correct.
So,
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we see this play out in the Canadian context just as well as we see it in the European Union, Australia, which we haven't even gotten around to mentioning today, or places like the United States.
okay. Something special about Australia that's
Oh, well, Australia has been one of the lead innovators actually in creating these detention systems. And since we're actually talking about migration by boat, just in passing,
yeah.
they're also one of the leaders in terms of innovating policy to basically try and control and manage the movement of people by boat.
innovating sounds like a good thing.
Sorry, yeah, it does, but it is not.
Yeah.
I promise
So,
you.
so what are they actually doing? What sort of new things have they implemented?
Well, for instance, they've literally excised parts of their territory for the purposes of immigration, which Canada copied them, by the way, in the late 1990s. So what Australia would literally do is say that some parts of their territory, which are by legal convention parts of Australia, you can no longer actually claim asylum in by virtue of being there. And even though, so basically you're inside of Australia, but you're not allowed to make an asylum claim, which is against international law. However, Canada did the same thing actually with incidents like the Fujian boat arrivals in 1999.
And so they've taken an area that's not part of, not within their borders necessarily, and declared that to be Australian territory, or?
Oh, it's the reverse. They've taken like a part of Australian territory and they've claimed it is not Australian territory for the purposes of claiming asylum. So, for example, let's say you literally arrive in Australia, but you can't even make a claim, which is against international law, because Australia has simply declared that for the purposes of immigration, you're not inside of Australia.
Right. So, since you're not there, you can't make the claim because you haven't arrived yet.
And in some places in Australia, you can literally arrive on land. You can literally be on the shores of Australia in their physical territory, and you cannot claim asylum. And it turns out that in the Canadian and American context, there are actually places like this too. We just don't usually think of them this way. So,
okay. Can you speak on irregular border crossings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of people call them irregular. I like the term undocumented, but even then, I think undocumented has a few problems with it. But sure, where would you like to speak about?
I hear illegal border crossings a lot, but from my understanding, crossing the border at a border crossing place isn't strictly illegal for refugee claiming.
No, it is not. There actually is a debate amongst different countries in the world about to which degree that applies, but it's quite clear in the Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugees that refugees have a right to move basically in order to stake a claim of asylum in a country. I wouldn't necessarily of their choice, but essentially wherever they are physically, they are allowed to stake an asylum claim. So not only do they have a right to move, but they also have a right to claim asylum if they are within the territory of a country.
Right. So when the irregular border crossings happen here in Canada, there are border guards present. I mean, these are apparently well-known corridors, well-known areas for traveling. And so even though they're not official border crossing places, there are still border guards at those locations.
Absolutely. And it's a kind of paradoxical situation because on the one hand, we have a country like Canada, which is trying very hard to try and force, asylum claims into specific sites so that they can control and manage them. But at the same time, they also recognize the existence of the fact that, it's, how should I say, you can't literally control the movement of every person that you want to. So sometimes people are invariably going to end up where you don't expect. And the fact that we place border guards there is a recognition of that fact.
Does the Safe Third Country Act apply at irregular border crossings?
Yes, it does.
Still does.
Yep, it applies everywhere in Canada.
Okay.
So we have safer, like one example is we have an agreement with the United States. So anyone who travels through the United States in the first place, so in the previous example of Israel, I said if you came from Palestine, for example, you would not get a right necessarily to claim asylum. And as it turns out, it's even extends further than that. So, for example, let's say that you're somebody who isn't from the United States, but you're somebody who traveled through the United States first to get to Canada. The Third Safe Country Agreement precludes you from making an asylum claim in Canada because you could have made one in the United States.
And I guess having made a claim in the United States, you're completely, a refugee is completely unable to make a second refugee claim in another country then?
In this case, basically what would happen is they would make a claim, but it would be summarily dismissed.
Yeah, without
without proper legal hearing, which again is in violation of international law, because the Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees establishes that every asylum claim has a right to a legal procedure, basically to process their application.
Okay. Are the courts overwhelmed by these claims?
I mean, I'm not an expert basically on the legislation or the system that exists, but from my knowledge of talking to other experts, no, we're not currently overwhelmed.
No. So there's no reason for these claims to be summarily dismissed.
I don't believe so. And unfortunately, this is not the only reason that such claims are summarily dismissed.
Yeah. What's to be done?
Well, essentially, we need to, just like I was saying, is remove this system of, well, if we're going to talk about summarily dismiss applications, we need to remove a system that basically allows this to occur in the first place. And I think probably the strongest way to start that is probably strip down these safe third country agreements that preclude the actual application of asylum seekers from all over the world, actually in Canada in the first instance. And even those who are from places that we normally recognize as maybe they're safe for most people if you're white and middle class and maybe a cis person, but are not necessarily safe if you're from some other group. So for example, many of the asylum claims from the United States recently have been from trans people, because many trans persons do not currently feel safe in the United States political climate, which, you know, as a trans person, I'm not really surprised. But do you mind if I keep going for another step?
No, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, tearing down these third safe country agreements, if it were up to me, I would probably totally remove the system of detention in the first instance. But some people would probably consider that extreme. I think a compromise, if you want to have a compromise, would be basically to strip down who can be detained, put strict limits on how long detention can occur, and basically have much more oversight and regulation of these facilities. Because the fact is that currently, at least from my perspective, they don't have sufficient oversight. And that's how we have violations continually occur and people literally dying. And that's why we can actually have, in many cases, children literally in detention, families literally in detention, and situations like these arising.
Yeah. So if not detention, what would happen to people claiming refugee status when they arrive at the border? If they aren't going to be tossed into the local prison there, what would happen? What do you envision happening?
Well, one thing we could do is we could integrate them into our local communities and give them a place to live. And in some rare cases, this actually does happen in different countries. So for example, in some jurisdictions, if you're a child, you're not actually put into detention, but what happens is you're placed into a residential, not like, how should I say, like a place of residence that's integrated in a local community. But on some level, because of the segregation that occurs on that basis, there still is some element of a detention scheme. But I think that this is closer to my idealization, I think, of what will work. Basically, we can have these people, refugees, these human beings in our communities, just like we have refugees in our communities today. And essentially, I think that the incentives for them to live and work and behave just like regular humans do are all there. So I don't think that we'd have any significant issues, honestly.
And freedom of movement.
Yeah, and I understand that there might be some concerns about having freedom of movement, but to be honest, we already have a system that has hundreds, well, maybe I shouldn't say obviously that many, but maybe thousands of refugees that live in Canada who currently do have freedom of movement. So what happens is once your asylum claim has been put into the system, you have a legal right to move within Canada anyway. So the fact is that we already have a system where freedom of movement on some level is guaranteed.
Okay. How do you go about enacting this? Talk to our MPs?
That would be one way, certainly. I think that a lot of this, well, there are two primary instruments for these changes. So one is federal legislation, which defines the parameters of basically what the ministries can do. But second, and even more importantly in the last 20 years, has been ministerial instructions. So essentially what's happening is that a lot of these ministries don't literally, well, they do follow the law. However, the thing is that specific situations arise. So a lot of it is kind of bureaucratic decision-making that occurs on the fly, as opposed to, say, a strict law that defines everything. So, for example, when we look at, say, IRCC, so the Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, how they often do these kind of legislative components is that they actually implement what are called ministerial instructions. So that is instructions that come directly from the minister that delineate how the bureaucrats in the ministry work. So likewise, basically what we need to do is not only target the legislation in order to make these broader changes that force the ministry to conform to these standards, but we also need to have more oversight in the ministries themselves so that basically the ministries don't issue instructions that are in contrary, at least from my opinion, in international human rights law.
Right. So back to a previous conversation, this would be a role for the academic to have in the political system, is to provide that policy background.
I think it'd certainly be a place where academics could do a lot of good. And, we were just talking, before the show came back on about how sometimes academics get very disconnected from the policy cycle.
Mhm.
And I know many of us who are guilty of this, myself being an academic. And I was going to say that this would definitely be a place, I think, where the knowledge and expertise that academics have could do a lot and go a very far way in helping to shape a better, more humane system of migration in Canada.
If I were to approach my MP, how well do you think the MP would be aware of the issues?
Well, to be honest, I haven't spoken with every MP, but I'd probably say not very well aware.
Yeah. And the minister himself?
That's a good question. The minister is typically a politician as well, whereas the deputy minister is typically the expert. So I would say the minister would have much more expertise than your average MP. But at the same time, I think we have to remember that the minister is ultimately basically an MP and a politician whose expertise is contingent basically on the experience they typically gather while doing their portfolio. So I think talking to the deputy minister would probably be a better approach. But at the same time, we all know the deputy minister reports to, the minister.
Right.
Yep.
So a campaign of possibly not approaching your MP directly, but writing to the minister or the ministerial office for, what's the portfolio there?
That's good. So here it's split into two. So basically first we have, how should I say it? Public Safety Canada, I believe, is where CBSA is technically housed. So basically you would need to talk with that ministry. And by the way, this is interesting that our border guard is separated partly from many of the other immigration systems that we have. But then the second would be to talk to IRCC, which is Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. So into your question, though, I would say that talking to your MP, I think, is still as valuable as it's ever been. I just think that talking to the minister as well is more direct, and I think may have arguably a little more impact. Yeah.
Okay. So do that thing. Speak with your MPs. It always comes down to that. It always comes down to speak with your MP, write to your MP, and in this case, write to the Ministry for Refugees and Citizenship.
But do other things too. So politics doesn't end with Parliament, and it doesn't end essentially with our formal political institutions, but it's our everyday life. So go to more public vigils, organize protests, do a thing a day. Try and find a way where you can make more decisions and strides. Read more news, share more on social media. I know it's easy to be a Facebook crusader, if you want to call it that. But at the same time, I think having some level of public engagement and disseminating more information is generally for the better.
Yeah, it's public awareness that needs to be brought up a little because, like I said, I didn't know many of these things until July the 12th, the day of the vigil.
And a lot of it's about narration, Bob. So I think that, we were talking a lot about how there are narratives of dehumanization with respect to migration. And these are kind of the narratives that get publicly played in media and by politicians. And I think what is critical as having policy solutions is forming counter narratives, essentially, that help tell the story of those who are detained, that tell the story of those who in Ontario, for instance, are working in under labor laws, on basically lower than standard conditions on farms, or for instance, live-in caregivers, as many may know, who basically work as full-time nannies effectively for families, again, under substandard labor conditions. And these things that you don't really get to learn about unless either you're an expert like me who studied it for years, or you hear a counter narrative essentially that exists where somebody is finally disseminating that information. So, somebody has to speak up, and maybe that person is you.
Oh, I'm doing my best here. Let me think about that some, because you've just given us an awful lot to digest. So let's return to JP Mortier and some more protest music from Nation of Iron.
When you've lost the will to live, looking for the sun on a cloudy day, and you've crossed the hills and valleys, looking for lost causes along the way. Venons-nous que sommes-nous? Où allons-nous? I've reached my breaking point to sown my need for redemption. I've breached my hard limit, sown the seeds of my destruction. Will we live long enough to see what we've done? See what we've done. The game is played, the cards were trumped, the deal was stacked, the sprinter has jumped, dice were loaded, the treasure's hoarded, the bank is closed, the house is boarded. Callums in a shoy. Ja, zo men er snel. They're at Brazilian. Ja, ik zie die snack. Nothing works unless it reaches the hand. Then decide when I pay the man. It's going on throughout the land. You're suburban land heading the sand. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going?
JP Mortier from the Nation of Iron album. That was Breaking Point. We're talking to Kira Williams and Christine Mayer from the Lights for Liberty. It was a vigil. I think it was a one-time event. There's no formal organization, is there?
There's no formal organization, but there's certainly a collective of people who are interested in this issue kind of going forward. So if you're interested in knowing more, you can certainly visit on Facebook the event page itself, so Lights for Liberty Kitchener-Waterloo. And there's both articles housed there, but also we've put up a sort of how to take next steps. What are some action steps that you can do, both small and big, some financial, some about writing to your MP, and we're going to add on to their writing to your minister and deputy minister after that brilliant advice from Kira, as well as some information about local Canadian organizations who do this kind of work. So that information is all available on Facebook. We have a link to Dropbox where you can sort of download all these documents and also some research articles to inform yourself more. And if you're interested in being in contact with us, the email is lights4, which is the digit 4, liberty, KW, @gmail.com. And we're happy to kind of help connect you with some other folks locally who are doing this kind of work and who are interested in what the next steps will be.
Right.
We know a one-time event is not going to change all of the things. It was an important first step for the three of us organizing and for those that came together. But there are many who've been doing this work for a long time and many who will continue to do it. So we're happy to do our best to link folks up.
So you have no event planned in the near future?
Not yet.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yep, please.
You have IDAPAN coming up. IDAPAN is the International Days of Peace and Nonviolence. International Day of Peace is September 21st. International Day of Nonviolence, September the 10th.
Beautiful.
So you have a 10-day stretch where WR Nonviolence celebrates IDAPAN. So if you were to put on something for that, a display, a town hall, a community meeting, a potluck perhaps, or a food luck, food luck, so you don't have to deal with the pot.
Yeah.
That would be a great event to target for the Days of International Peace, Days of Peace and Nonviolence.
That's a great suggestion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We'll have to follow up with you about that.
Oh, by all means, yeah. Are you on Facebook? Are you on Twitter? Are you on what, MySpace and
Sorry, is this a personal question for each of us, or for Lights for Liberty specifically?
Lights for Liberty.
Lights for Liberty is on Facebook. There's also a website that is the broader campaign outside of the KW specific. So if you just Google Lights for Liberty, you'll end up on the main page there. They have a Twitter account. There's several hashtags that are going as well. I'm not a Twitterer, so I can't give you all the info, but I know it exists. So that's a lot of that work there.
I'll dig that out and stick it all on the show notes
that would be
on the
beautiful.
page for
and
today.
we can send you some of the action steps as well, so you can have it on the page if you'd like.
Stick those there too, absolutely, because that's not stuck behind a paywall or stuck behind advertising or anything else.
Perfect. Yeah, that would be great.
All right. What's in your own future in the next little while?
I'm heading into what will hopefully be my final year of dissertating, and we'll be headed towards applying for an academic job. I'm very much interested in sort of the intersection between research and policy. For me, it's in the school system and how trauma comes into play in the school system, and how do we better support kids equitably who've experienced harm. So that's where most of my work is focused, and that's what's in the future, I hope. But we'll see what life brings. This was not what I thought I was going to be doing this summer, and it's been beautiful to be on a ride with Lights for Liberty. And I think that's part of being a good citizen, is being open to doing what needs to be done, and not trying to pre-plan all of the things, but listening carefully to the human injustices that are occurring, and being willing to step up and do what we can to try to be able to prevent these things from happening on an ongoing basis. So
and you'll be continuing with that as well as your research
I hope
studies.
so. Yeah, it feels connected to me very much. Yeah. So
Sarah,
that's it.
How about you? What's up for you?
Well, nominally, I'm looking for a job as an academic. It's always a bit of an interesting time in that field. I'd like to become a professor. I love teaching. It's a really big, I was going to almost say hobby of mine, but fascination of mine. This year, I'm going to be teaching a number of courses, mostly actually related to public policy. Mostly I teach statistics and public policy. So I try and teach basically students how we can kind of analyze and gather evidence related to public policy and analyze different policies using that evidence. But I'd love to be able to be a professor and to continue my research with respect to social justice issues, international migration, and honestly, some of the more niche philosophical and statistical problems that I have too. Yeah.
Philosophical problems. What sort of philosophical problems would you be addressing?
Oh, well, in my research, I was somebody who was trained as a mathematical economist, and I kind of fell into what we call critical human geography. So I fell into this one school that's very kind of math focused and very, very strong on trying to do logic, to a school that was more about thinking critically and having a critical lens about the world and deconstructing things. And it turns out that philosophically, those two different schools are actually quite at odds with each other. So a lot of my research has been about trying to reconcile how you take a lot of these methods that we've learned in social science that are the basis of what we do in research, and try to be able to turn them so they have this critical lens too, so that we don't ignore the social issues that are associated with them, so we don't ignore their application.
This sounds like a course. This sounds like something that you would teach.
It is. And in fact, in almost all my courses, I start off by trying to teach just a little bit of this, because it turns out that no matter what you do in terms of the way that you approach and learn about the world, that there are almost always assumptions that underlie how we go about doing that.
Right.
So in my courses, what I try and do is first take a look at our fundamental assumptions and then try and think about critically, what do those assumptions mean and how do they relate to basically what we want to achieve?
These are the biases that, right, internal biases that influence how we interpret the data that we
Absolutely. That's
allegedly
exactly it.
gather with no biases in them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And that's how I see data itself. Like, many people have different perspectives, but my perspective is that your biases come into play when you analyze data, when you collect data, when you basically make any kind of interpretation of data. You know, interpretation, in my opinion, is as much as art as a science. And that's why people can say things like statistics lie. But on the other hand, I think that it's not necessarily saying that methods are bad. I think that we just need to be able to appreciate that in this art of interpretation, that power is at play. And basically, if we don't appreciate that power, then we're going to fall, maybe, I'm trying to think of a good way to put it. We're basically going to fall to our own prejudices, I think is a good way to put it.
And the very same prejudices we see everywhere else in social constructs and academic constructs and political constructs.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, you can have all the evidence in the world, you can have the best interpretation, the strongest scientific model, but whether policymakers choose to listen to you or not can be heavily dependent upon their own worldviews and perspectives.
So possibly a bit of spin and marketing on the academic findings that you make.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when I teach students, usually what we end the course with is we start thinking about the policy implications of what we're doing and how exactly do you go about talking to a policymaker about your research? Because the fact is that it's not even just a matter of having different prejudices or worldviews. It's also a matter of policymakers are real humans who have limited time. So for example, if you want to meet the minister and talk about your research, you get like 2 to 5 minutes to give your elevator pitch effectively. Yeah. And you have to do it in a way that the minister can understand. Because just like we said, the minister is usually a politician, not a technical expert on your issue.
And politicians get drawn from the general public.
Absolutely.
So, might have been somebody who was interested in, just some municipal enhancement for the road that got them involved in politics, and suddenly they find themselves the Minister of Immigration and Refugees.
Absolutely. So you don't have to be a technical expert in order to become the minister. Now, I'm not saying that to disparage our ministers, but what I am saying is that if you're going to, for instance, interact with this institutional political structure, you have to understand basically the constraints that you operate in. And basically, if you can't explain your policy or your policy recommendations in an elevator speech, then unfortunately, it seems like in many cases, the minister isn't going to be able to listen to you.
Right. On a non-academic front, what's in your future? Going to stay involved with Lights for Liberty?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I joined the mailing list, and I've been in touch basically with some of the chief organizers, which has been really wonderful. And I'm hoping to be part of more events in the future. In terms of like other things in the area, I don't know, get more relaxation, try and enjoy the weather, work on maybe some poetry, musical compositions, and some programming. Yeah. You know, it's nice to have some hobbies, I guess. And share some of those with other people too.
Yeah, that's great. All right, I'm going to turn to a little bit more music. I want to read some of the events on the KWP's calendar. Don't go away, because I'll just want to finish off the hour with the both of you. So Kira Williams and Christine Mayer from Lights for Liberty. Let's return to JP Mortier and more music.
Strangers in my house, shadows on every wall. There are aliens in my skies. They don't know how to land at all. There are people I don't trust. There are uninvited guests. They spread themselves in every room, hatch your eggs in every nest. I've got an arsenal on every wall. I sleep with one eye open, alert to every emotion. Their cameras screaming with rifle motion. There are foreigners on my soil. They are laying low. There are truths in the art. And as the saying goes, no security and the world's cheapest. Security is mortal's chiefest enemy.
In times of shadows, deep into the night, your love is all shines through the blind. In times of sadness, in times of madness, in the deepest fathoms, love burns brightest. In times of shadows, in times of war, in times of hate, that's when your heart helps me escape. In times of trouble, when I lose my faith, you are my guide. Show me the way. In times of war, The time for forgiveness, make things right. Your love's my star, lights up my nights. In times of shadow, deep into the night, your love is all that shines tonight. In times of shadow,
J.P. Mortier from the album Nation of Iron. And we were just listening to Shadows, before that, Corridors. His entire album is available online from CD Baby. I'll provide a link in the show notes so that you can buy the album and show your appreciation to J.P. Mortier for this. Having the studio Christine Mayer and Kira Williams, both involved with the Lights for Liberty single-time, one-time event, but hopefully to be the start of a whole social justice movement to address incarceration at border crossings, migrant issues, local Canadian-specific issues for economic, incarceration, I suppose. That's what Samantha Estoesta said. All these issues still need addressing, and you're doing that.
Yes.
Yes. This is radio.
That's the work.
Doesn't
Nodding
work.
doesn't help, I realize. Yeah. Yes, that's what we're working on together. Yeah.
Very good. I'd like to take a couple of minutes out to read from the KW Peace events list. Lights for Liberty was, of course, on KW Peace as well. Have a link to that in the show notes. Starting on Tuesday, nothing happening today, but starting on Tuesday, August the 6th, we have a PhD dissertation defense, Governing Sovereign Bankruptcy and Writing International Rules for Rewriting National Debt, taking place at the Balsillie School of International Affairs on August the 6th at 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. It's Skylar Brooks's PhD dissertation defense, and we have no real information about the content of that, but go to the Balsillie School at 1 p.m. tomorrow and learn all about sovereign bankruptcy. At 6 p.m. on Tuesday, August the 6th, we have a Hungry Minds event called Memory, Understanding the Mechanics of the Mind in that ever so complex workshop in your head. It's casual conversation about the mind works, and it's mostly focused on a potential subtopic, which is to be determined. Taking place at the Pub on King, 77 King Street North in Waterloo, 6 p.m. on Tuesday, August the 6th. Also on Tuesday at 6 o'clock, Upcycling 101 with KW professional organizers, taking place at the Waterloo Public Library at the main branch. If you've been looking for ways to reduce waste and repurpose those useful items around the house, then you won't want to miss this event. KW professional organizers want to inspire you with the many examples for around the house to lessen your footprint while being creative. You'll walk away with strategies for making small changes that will have positive impact. It's a drop-in. You don't need to register. 6 p.m. at the Waterloo Public Library main branch. Every Tuesday, there is the regular meeting for WR Nonviolence, 7 o'clock at the Queen Street Commons Cafe, where WR Nonviolence people discuss the themes and organize activities for nonviolence. IDAPAN is coming up. Hopefully an event for Lights for Liberty going to take place in that. IDAPAN takes place from the International Day of Peace on September the 21st to the International Day of Nonviolence on October the 2nd. Come to the Queen Street Commons Cafe, 43 Queen Street South, 7 o'clock, and meet the folks sitting at the front there. On Wednesday, August the 7th, there will be a sunset yoga in nature at the Rare Charitable Research Reserve. Join Joe Van Groningen from Moda Yoga Cambridge for a sunset yoga in nature class, a 60-minute yoga practice dedicated to toning the body, calming the mind, and connecting with nature. Taking place at the Charitable Research Reserve in Cambridge. Also in Cambridge, Kids in the Garden, a workshop on soil pollinators and things that wiggle. That's taking place on Thursday, August the 8th, 10 o'clock in the morning. at the Springbank Gardens. Bring your family and join them to learn all about soil, permaculture, and pollinators. A local beekeeper will be sharing the fascinating importance of bees in the rare Cambridge Food Bank Gardens. It's a workshop in collaboration with the Cambridge Self-Help Food Bank, and that's taking place at Springbank Gardens, 10 o'clock, Thursday, August the 8th. Finally, Friday, August the 9th, there's a night market. Experience art, music, and food at Renaissance Night Market with a variety of vendors. There'll be lots of sights and sounds to enjoy while you savor cuisine from all around the world. Join them for a family-friendly evening to help celebrate Renaissance 60th anniversary, 6 to 10 p.m. at the Renaissance Upper Parking Lot at 240 West Mount Street North. And there's a list of vendors that you can see by going to kwpeace.ca, the KW Peace calendar. Just look at the events list and you'll see everything that's happening in Kitchener and Waterloo in the way of social justice events, environmental events, peace, and things like Lights for Liberty. Anything you'd like to add? You've got about 5 minutes left before the top of the hour. Talk to us about your future. Lights for Liberty happening in Idapan.
One of the things I'd love to do, if possible, is just to thank some of our speakers and performers from the event itself.
Run down who's all at the event.
Yeah, so I'd love to just kind of quickly go through those and maybe talk about the co-sponsors for the event as well, if possible. So we began the night with Anishinaabe Elder Banaconda Kennedy Kishbel, who opened in ceremony for us with an opening prayer and remarks. Amy and Sky Smoke, who are mother and daughter from Mohawk Nation Turtle Clan of the Six Nations of Grand River, did a Mohawk Thanksgiving address and also spoke about the importance of language rights and the impact of residential schools intergenerationally. We had Kate Glasson, who's the president of Spectrum from Waterloo Region's Rainbow Community Space, who spoke about LGBTQ issues and in particular spoke about the 2 trans women who have died in the U.S. Detention camps and really was sort of calling attention to the ways in which sexual orientation and gender identity also disproportionately can leave particular populations in harm's way in terms of migrant detention. We had Kira Williams with us, who's here today as well. Leila El Mugammar, who is a queer Black Muslim woman, scholar, author, and archivist, who did a beautiful sort of spoken word performance, who traced the ways in which race and colonization shows up in Canadian history and in current policy. And I encourage you to look up her performance and poetry work. She has a website as well and has done all kinds of really beautiful things in this sort of area. We had Lori Campbell, who's the local NDP candidate, talk about some of the sort of relationship between residential schools, the 60s scoop, and the current sort of foster care system, and how that is sort of paralleled to and is being replicated in a different kind of way, the separation of children and families at the border and sort of the relationship between that. And in addition, Michelle Sutherland, who's the executive director of White Owl Native Ancestry Association, who does quite a lot of work around actually ending the separation of Indigenous children in the foster care system altogether. Samantha Estoesta, who we've called out during this talk this morning, who's also a poet and a diversity, inclusion, and equity advocate and a Migrante member, spoke about and performed a poem as well about economic detention in Canada and thinking about those who may be technically free within Canada to be here, but actually are not because of poverty and incarceration within homes and within fields. Serene Fox, who is an Anishinaabe activist, artist, and television host, gave both a talk and a bit of a sort of spoken word performance, I would say, about the intersection with Indigenous issues. And last but certainly not least, we had Sasha Karimovic, who is part of the multicultural program and legal aid clinic facilitator at Spectrum, who talked about his own experiences as a refugee and also spoke about the intersection with gender and sexual orientation as well. So we had a fabulous group of speakers out that night, hosted by or emceed by Healy, and sponsored by a great number of different organizations, the Center for Indigidaji, the Manulife Center for Community Health Research, the Social Innovation Research Group, White Owl Native Ancestry Organization, Prisoners Justice Film Festival, Spectrum, and the International Migration Research Center.
Lovely. Thank you, Christine Mayer. Thank you, Kira Williams. You've been listening to CKMS Community Connections. We've been speaking to Christine Mayer and Kira Williams from the Lights for Liberty. Coming up next is the Lost in the City and their Zen program.